Like there's a lot of sexy movements. There's a lot of exciting movements and they're fun and they're dynamic. And again, you can take them outside. But with that said, a lot of people miss the developmental steps and miss looking at that tool and also their own journey in fitness, like a little more realistically. Like I think in a loving way, one of the jobs that I try to do really well is give people a realistic picture of where they are now and the plan on how to get there. Not long after I got into kettlebell training, actually while I was training at Westside Barbell in Columbus, Ohio, Louise Simmons, who's since passed, he's the one who introduced me to the kettlebell there, training out there for a few weeks. But when I got back, I just fell in love with the kettlebell. And even for example, the kettlebell swing, which is, so if you were to break down the developmental regression of the snatch, you'd have the snatch as like the king, for example. And then right below that, you have the clean. Then right below that, you have the swing. Then right below that, you have the deadlift. And so those are just some of the developmental chunks. They tend to see these sexy things, or they tend to see things on Instagram, people doing flows and complexes and snatches and a lot of these crazy stuff that are awesome. But even when I'm teaching, and oftentimes most of the people I've taught to over the years have been coaches and trainers, even with coaches and trainers, I mean, where often people think they are from an athletic or just a skill level with the tool, it's a very specific tool. It's a unique tool. It's very different than other things that they may be very good at. And so people oftentimes have a very unrealistic picture of where they are. And so they want to do the snatch. They want to get right into it. And I'm like, let me just see it first. So let's see where we're at. And I'll pick out like 15 errors that they're making.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast with your host, Leigh Brandon. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and a warm review. And now, here is Leigh, the Radical Health Rebel, with this week's podcast.
Salemi, welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. How are you, buddy?
Dude, doing good today, man. Bright and early in California, and very excited to be chatting with you. I know this is a long time coming, buddy.
Yeah, and it's good to see you again. I was thinking earlier today that, you know, we met once in London in a coffee shop a few years back, and we probably haven't even had a conversation since then.
Yeah, I think I remember that now. Yeah, I absolutely remember that when I was out in the UK teaching. Absolutely.
And I remember that I was quite disappointed because you were teaching your kettlebell workshop, and I couldn't make it. I can't remember why, but I couldn't make it. And I was like, damn, I can't make your course, which I really wanted to, but everything happens for a reason, right? Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, I haven't been, I don't think, back to the UK since then. But I love teaching out there. You know, the people, the students, and so much of the students that I have, obviously there's a crossover with the Chek Institute and stuff like that. So there's just this common mindset and common approach to health, wellness, and fitness. So what I find, like when I teach to Chek Institute students, there's not that there's really much convincing, I would say, in the work that I do, especially in the movement. Like I usually don't have to convince many people. I think most of them get it, but the Chek Institute students get the entire picture, you know, and so you know, speaking about the 4 doctors or, you know, why this is important or why we do what we do, they really just get it, which makes it so much more easy to do.
Most of the Czech students in the UK have had a very good teacher, you see.
That's right. That's right.
Matt Walden's a very good teacher. Cool. So today's episode is entitled Mastering the Kettlebell with Mike Salemi. And over the last 30 years or so, you know, I've seen many a fitness fad come and go. I've also seen a number of things stay the course too, which usually suggests its long-term effectiveness. In recent years, the kettlebell burst onto the scene and is now used in gyms, homes, and parks all around the world. The kettlebell can be a great exercise tool and can be great fun to use as well. However, like any resistance training modality, it also comes with its risks if not used safely and effectively. Now, where have we heard that term before? The kettlebell certainly became my most frequently used tool in my fitness toolbox as we were plunged into lockdown and gyms around the world were closed in 2020. So I enjoyed working out on my balcony in the sunshine in 2020 and used Mike's Mastering the Kettlebell course to ensure that my technique was safe and effective. I do sadly see many people in gyms using the kettlebell when perhaps they're not structurally or physically prepared to do so, or with technique that is going to lead them down a slippery slope of pain and injury. So Mike, to kick things off, would you share with the audience a little bit about you, your upbringing, your career to date, and an overview of your athletic achievements as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate what you shared, just kicking that off, because I think you summed up a lot of how people approach a lot of the roadblocks and some of the things. I think with kettlebell training specifically, like there's a lot of sexy movements. There's a lot of exciting movements, and they're fun and they're dynamic. And again, you can take them outside. But with that said, a lot of people miss the developmental steps and miss looking at that tool and also their own journey in fitness, like a little more realistically. Like I think in a loving way, one of the jobs that I try to do really well is give people a realistic picture of where they are now and the plan on how to get there. And for me, like I've always really appreciated and loved like a methodical way to approach training. And so when I was younger, like my athletic background, I really started getting into gymnastics. I was a gymnast from 7 to 14. And then in that whole experience, my ability to develop a higher level of body awareness and of confidence and a movement, like my movement vocabulary was really increased in gymnastics. And even though I didn't go to college to be a gymnast or anything like that, that fundamental base served me so well in everything else that I did. And so even when I competed in powerlifting after that for 10 years, where the lifts are fairly simple, you have a squat, a bench, and a deadlift. So they're very linear type movements. But because I had the base of gymnastics, I really felt like having the flexibility, the mobility, the body awareness, being explosive, training all these biomotor abilities. I took that into powerlifting. And I think the combination of that base level of strength, that's what really set me up to, I would say, like maybe thrive with the kettlebell before I even touched it. And I think a lot of those base fundamental levels of strength, of control, and then of course having the flexibility, mobility, and the awareness piece, I think a lot of people miss that today. So I really got into competitive powerlifting in one drug-free organization. I was a world champion, the WABDL, in the bench press and the deadlift. Not long after I got into kettlebell training, actually while I was training at Westside Barbell in Columbus, Ohio. Louise Simmons, who since passed, he's the one who introduced me to the kettlebell there. Training out there for a few weeks. But when I got back, I just fell in love with the kettlebell. And I'm excited to share, a little bit more about that. But I've competed for 10 years in kettlebell sports since no longer competing, since retired about 5 years, but was able to reach the elite rank of Master of Sport. And all during those years, the last 20 years that I've been a competitive athlete, dealt with a lot of injuries, a lot of setbacks. And in each setback, I always say it opened the door to a whole new way of looking at the body and really even working with someone like Paul Chek very closely. So that's a very brief summary of, where I started and how I entered the kettlebell stuff. But everything that I've done to this point, I believe matters. And I think a lot of, looking back, I'm so grateful, even though I probably couldn't see it as clearly when I was in it, but the fundamentals and the foundations of gymnastics, like I still thank my parents for that, because that was huge.
So you were just repeat what ages you did gymnastics.
So gymnastics was 7 to 14. So freshman year of high school ish, or right before high school is when I got out of it.
Yeah. And did you do that to quite a high level?
No, I mean, I was not a compulsory gymnast, so I was in the optional level. So I was I was definitely in it, but I wasn't, I wasn't super, I was on the, definitely the represented Northern California, but I wasn't a super special gymnast by any means.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's ex-gymnast that I know. I don't know if you know Ross Ethorn.
No, not familiar.
From New Zealand. So he lives in Hong Kong now.
Okay.
He was a high level gymnast. I did some of my Chek training with him. And, what I found, my experience, working in health and fitness over a long period of time, is that some of the strongest people I've ever come across were either ex-gymnasts or gymnasts.
Okay.
And, I can remember, I'm going back a long time, but a friend of mine who was junior Mr. Britain bodybuilder, and he was teaching a course in the Netherlands. And there was a guy in his class who was a gymnast, and he was teaching them, fitness stuff. And, he was doing some great, the guy had never seen a Swiss ball before. He'd never done any weight training before. And he was just doing this most crazy stuff on a Swiss ball. So my friend, who was, he was very good at, exercising on the Swiss ball, even though you think bodybuilder, but he was amazing on the Swiss ball. And so he was showing the class probably stuff he probably shouldn't have been showing them. But he said this gymnast could just do whatever he could do immediately. No practice, jumping on the ball, doing a 360 in the air, landing on the ball, his eyes closed and all this kind of stuff.
Wow.
He said so my friend, he was a big guy, right? He was ex-junior Mr. Britain. Big guy, really strong guy as well. And he said to this gymnast, what can you bench press? He's like, I've never done it before. And he was probably, he wasn't a big guy necessarily. And I can't remember the numbers, but my friend, he would have been bench pressing a ridiculous amount of weight back then. He said the gymnast matched him.
Wow.
And he was a lot lighter than him, and he'd never bench pressed before. He said he just had a ridiculous, nervous system, and he was just so strong. And the other type of people I've come across over the years that have been very strong are male ballet dancers.
Wow. Yeah.
Ridiculously strong. But I guess it's quite similar to gymnastics, isn't it?
I think so. I remember growing up, and I was training a lot when I was a gymnast. Like we were training, easily 4 to 6 days a week consistently for 3-hour sessions, oftentimes minimum. And I remember one of my teammates, actually, his mom, they were Japanese. They were a Japanese family, and he was a phenomenal gymnast, phenomenal. I think he was about my age, more or less. And we had trained together for a few years, but his mom and his family wanted really him to enter and be an elite level gymnast and ballet. And so he did those two for years and years and years. And he was in like very high level productions and such. And then when he hit high school, and I lost touch with him, but when we had reconnected, or actually I had heard about him from a friend first before we reconnected briefly, but I had heard he dropped both of those, dropped both gymnastics and ballet. And when he was in high school, he chose to do wrestling. And without any wrestling experience going into it, he was dominating everybody. For him, it was just, I believe, just learning the technique and some of the, the sequences and the maneuvers, etc. But with a base of gymnastics and ballet going into wrestling, my gosh, like the only thing that was missing was the cauliflower ears. And now he's got plenty of those.
Yes. Interesting. So you did gymnastics 7 to 14.
Yep.
And what age again did you do the powerlifting?
Powerlifting was, right about 14, because I stopped and went right into it. So 14 to about 24-ish. But when I was like 21 to 24, that's when I started also competing in Olympic weightlifting. Also during that time, I was into kettlebells as well. So I competed off and on for those 10 years, but really towards the end is when I started exploring the other stuff. Okay.
So was there a point when you was doing powerlifting, weightlifting, and kettlebell competitions around the same time? Or did they not overlap?
Not competing. When I was, right when I was 19 is when I went to Westside Barbell. So that's when I started really first diving into and started taking certifications and that sort of stuff. And actually at one certification, the assistant instructors were kettlebell sport athletes. Because before that, I had never heard of kettlebell sport. It's a very small sport worldwide, and especially back then. And so I had actually gone to a certification, and the assistant instructors pulled me aside and they're like, yo, like, I think, you'd be really good at this. And I was like, what are you talking about? What is this thing? And so they broke down what kettlebell sport was. And one of the instructors actually lives like maybe 50 minutes away from me and had a kettlebell sport team at the time. So I was like, great. So I ended up just going with him and training in part of the Orange Kettlebell Club for years.
So I'd imagine quite a lot of the audience don't really know what the sport kettlebell is. Can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a question I often get. And with kettlebell sport now, because it's becoming more accessible to more people around the world, there's many more events that they've added in and specialty stuff, and also making it more accessible, because the main way that kettlebell sport is, and I'll describe the classical lifts, they're fucking brutal. Like, they are really, really hard. And so for people, let's just say CrossFitters or who are very fit and could potentially thrive in kettlebell sport, even people with a high level of fitness and who are beast, it's a very specific sport, highly specialized movements. And so you could be really strong and really fit, but in order to reach an elite level, you need to dedicate the time and the energy and really the devotion to this specific sport. So they've made some concessions, and they've come up with some really fun, different events that are more accessible. But really the two biggest events are what's called long cycle. That was the main one that I competed in for a long time. And that is essentially for the men, professional division. Now there's different weights and weight classes and such like that. But for the professional division, as a standard, to give the listeners an idea, I had to lift 232 kilos. So about 70-ish pounds, one in each hand. You have to do repetitive clean and jerk. So you swing the bell through behind the legs to the chest and then jerk them into the overhead lockout position. And you repeat that consecutively as many times as you can without setting the bells down in 10 minutes. And so based off of the bell weight that you use, your body weight, and then your repetitions, legal repetitions, there's always a judge there judging if it's a legal rep. Did you actually pause in the lockout position? Were your arms fully straight, for example? Did you stand fully erect? And then that is one event. And then the second event, which I also competed in, is called biathlon. And essentially biathlon, you take 2 kettlebells, again, 32 kilos in each hand, and you jerk for 10 minutes. So from the chest to overhead, no setting the bells down in 10 minutes. They take that score, and then you come back later in the day, or actually oftentimes they'll do, depending on the organization, the order could switch sometimes, but you'll do the snatch. So a single kettlebell snatch. So 32 kilos in one hand, 10 minutes unbroken, swinging beneath the body, and then all the way into an overhead lockout position. And you only get one hand switch. So let's just say, for strategy purposes, your right hand could crush your left hand. You might do 7 minutes on one hand, 3 minutes the other, but you only get one hand switch. And basically it's the combined of the jerk and the snatch that give you a biathlon score. So for me, I was able to hit Master of Sport, which is like a black belt level in both of those events, which is interesting because typically, I mean, they're both strength endurance events, but the type of person, the mentality, and also oftentimes the body composition is slightly different with those two lifters, because you have a 20-minute event and a 10-minute event. Both are strength endurance in the endurance realm, but they both take a different type of person that to do that.
So what is the difference?
So long cycle for me, like mentality wise, it's going to be more like a garbage man, just like a gritty, you just really can't, you just have to bite down and go. So that person tends to be just like a little bit more intense potentially. Whereas what I see in the other event being more endurance, a lot of people, for some reason, that when I'm thinking about past clients and past people, a lot of people who have come from the endurance background, at least in my recollection, so cyclists and stuff like that, they tend to gravitate oftentimes to those longer events and tend to enjoy that. So, but also too, like my body composition, I'm a fast twitch athlete, especially being in powerlifting and doing Olympic weightlifting. So for me, like I love the clean and jerk. I absolutely do. And that was just, for me, it was a harder event, I would say, than biathlon for me, but that was equally, that challenge is what I appreciated and really wanted to dig into. So I loved long cycle. There
was 2 words that came into my mind as you were speaking about those two different events. One was pain and the other one was torture. Just the thought of doing those. And what weight were you competing at when you were doing those?
So I did shift from weight classes, but I was typically about, I'm trying to think in kilos, I was usually about 75 kilos of body weight, more or less. And I think I actually competed in the 69 as well at one point. And I'd also competed with double 40 kilos as well. But that's more of like, that's a different, not too many people compete at that weight. So that's like a kind of not quite like a feat of strength, but it's more of like a specialty event.
Wow. That sounds crazy. It was interesting because I was thinking, if I was to guess what your weight, when I saw you, what your weight was, I would have guessed 75 to 80. I would have guessed.
Yeah.
As your weight, which I'm guessing you probably still are now, roughly around there.
You know what's interesting? What's surprisingly is, I'm actually about the same weight, but I've definitely lost a good amount of muscle. Like right now, especially in the last few years, I mean, my main focus for training has just been for health and then teaching a lot. Like most of my movement actually happens when I'm teaching. So my training looks very different than what it used to, but I'm actually surprised. Like I'm still fairly lean, and obviously still eat really well and still take care of myself, but my body weight is actually still very close to what it was, but definitely have lost some muscle for sure.
Yeah. You wait till you get to my age.
Well, dude, if I get to your age looking like you and moving like you, I'm really happy. You're almost 20 years older than me, or like maybe like 18 or so. So if I get to your age and look like you and move like you, it's a good day. It's a really good life. Let's say that.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask you again in 2 years' time when your little one's been around.
Oh. Well, like it, and that's one thing that's been so at the forefront of my mind, and something that you touched on in the beginning is like whether it was, during COVID and when people are lifting at home or just, when you have a baby and time is just so precious. The beautiful thing about kettlebell training is like, you really don't need a tremendous amount of time. I mean, I honestly spend as much time warming up and cooling down as I do kettlebell training in a session. I mean, in a 15-minute or a 10-minute warm up, 5-minute touch the bells, do some of the movements to prepare, 15-minute workout with a 5 to 10-minute cool down. Like I'm done. I spent as much time preparing and finishing as I did in the lift. So one of the things that I do think is an advantage, not just for me, but anybody listening who doesn't have much time, is looking for an efficient way to train, whether you have kids or not, or you got a lot of priorities, a lot, job responsibilities, etc. If you know how to use the tool, you can be incredibly effective. Now, I know when I have a kid, my energy levels are going to be likely lower. I'm not going to be sleeping as much, but that doesn't mean that I'll stop training. But I'll just be adjusting the volume, the load, and maybe the expectation that I have for myself, or the standard. Like even now, this is something that I battled with for years since I've stopped competing. And Lauren laughs at me, my partner, because I'm like, oh, I'm so much weaker than I was, or like I couldn't even I'd have to train really hard to lift 40 kilos again. I mean, it's been 5 years since I've done that. So I'm nowhere near as strong as I used to or could do what I did, but I've still managed and maintained a high level of just movement capability. And so mobility, flexibility, skill development has really been my focus over the last 5 years. And just understanding what is, like, my goal is not what it was before. And so I need to change those expectations, those standards as I'm evolving. And so, when the baby comes, like, I'm not going to expect that I'm going to be lifting double 32s. But if I can do 24s, 20s and just really just feel good, that's my main priority. So for anybody listening, no matter where you are in life, what phase you are in life, the kettlebell, based off of the uniqueness of how it's constructed and the way you can train with it in multiple planes, hitting multiple patterns, training your nervous system, like, there's such a focus on skill development that you can transfer into so many things, and you don't need much time, especially if you know how to use it effectively.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I found myself that when I bought myself a set of kettlebells at the beginning of lockdown, I'd do maybe 3 or 4 sets of 3 exercises, and I was fried. That's all I needed. And it was a really good workout. I thought, wow, it would have taken me probably 45 minutes to do that with barbells, dumbbells, and cables. But I guess the other thing I feel is as well, you do a kettlebell workout and it just feels like you've hit completely different muscle fibers. It feels like tendons have been stressed in a good way. Your joints have been stressed in a good way. And you just know that your body is, as long as you give it what it needs afterwards, it's developing in a different way as well. I don't know if you find that, just whether it feels very different from lifting weights or dumbbells, cables, etc.
Yeah, that is so true. Like when I'm very grateful, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that I had a gymnastics background heading into powerlifting, but stopping gymnastics and doing 10 years of powerlifting, what I did notice within my body is, yes, I had a high level of absolute strength and I felt just very, very strong, but my flexibility decreased exponentially. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't feel as just confident in my body movements, and coming from having this incredible expression of just movement options and positions and strength in these weird angles and lines. And so when I got into kettlebell lifting, for me, it was a beautiful bridge, because I was like, wow, I can get really strong and feel very fit, stronger than even I would want to get on I felt very strong, but I was able to maintain high levels of mobility and flexibility and do the coordination components. So I really enjoyed that aspect of kettlebells, because I really felt like it was a beautiful bridge to where strength can really meet athleticism. A lot of the tools today, not that there's not a time and a place for things like barbells, absolutely. Mm. However, if the main goal is to be very athletic, the fact that you're only primarily training, for example, just front to back in the sagittal plane, like in rotation, I felt very vulnerable, super vulnerable. And so whether it's the kettlebell or a tool like the Bulgarian bag, the ability to rotate or train lateral movements, I almost felt like when I was walking, the vision that I have is when I would be jogging or running or doing something, let's say I'm running at the track, when I would start making a cut around a corner, it literally felt, when I was in powerlifting, like my shoes were untied. Like I just didn't feel confident in my footing or my grip. Like I never had that, okay, let's train around a curve. Let's train lateral movement. Let's train rotational movement. Mm. And so with the kettlebell, for example, that's just one. Now I just feel so much more rooted and integrated, and everything that you said about the tendons, the ligaments, the nervous system, for me, that nervous system, that is the component connected to skill development. And there's a lot of skill involved in kettlebell training, that if you do it, it will transfer into any sport and activity that you can do. You can take that capability and you can utilize it in anything that you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was quite interesting the first time I did a single arm snatch with a kettlebell. you realize straight away there's quite a lot of rotation involved. You have to rotate. Whereas if you're doing a double arm snatch, there's no rotation. But as soon as you go single arm, now all of a sudden you added rotation into the movement.
Yep, absolutely. And I think too, there's and I don't know, I have to be mindful of, sometimes I geek out so much that it's just like, are people even like, am I going too far with this? But with the snatch per se, I want to just share something, because there is rotation is okay. Rotation is okay. I think especially in kettlebells, there's a lot, still to this day, there's a lot of dogma. And in any sport, in any activity, there's going to be people who have fixed mindsets around things. And so with kettlebells, oftentimes what I was exposed to in the early years was this overly rigid, overly fixed approach that the body can't rotate, the body shouldn't rotate. So even if you're lifting one bell, keep everything as square as possible. And while I do believe that you need to have control and awareness of the spine and what it's doing, like you need to be able to maintain your spine and activate your core, etc. But rotation is okay in the snatch. And in fact, it actually should happen. If you're not rotating, you're missing out on a huge ability to generate force and power and transfer it from the legs through the core into the arm, into the kettlebell. And so we need to rotate. And when you look at most life and sport activities, rotation, unless you're in, unless you're in powerlifting, which is a very strict sagittal plane sport, unless you're doing something like that, most of the activities that we need to do on a day-to-day basis involve rotation, involve lateral movement. And so like our mentor, Paul, would say, if you can't, you must. And so what I really believe is, in that movement, the snatch, I mean, there's so much going on there from just the patterns that are involved. You have a hinging movement, you have some rotation. There's an overhead component, which a lot of people have difficulty with. You've got to generate power, and you've got to generate power repetitively. You've got to control and decelerate this weight safely and effectively. Then you've got to return it and accelerate it up. So there's a lot of things going on the snatch. And that rotation piece, I just want to emphasize, that is A-okay, provided you can maintain your spine, and is actually a big advantage to the lift.
Yeah. And also, just to add to that, as long as it's carefully staged progression and you're getting enough rest, recovery in between workouts, and you're giving your body all the nutrients it needs to recover, then that is really the optimal solution.
That's so true, man. And even for example, the kettlebell swing, which is, so if you were to break down the developmental regression of the snatch, you'd have the snatch as like the king, for example, and then right below that you have the clean, then right below that you have the swing, then right below that you have the deadlift. And so those are just some of the developmental chunks. But even a swing, and I bring this up because even a swing, which is probably the swing and the Turkish get-up, in my opinion, are probably two of the most iconic movements that people, when they think kettlebell training, whether they've seen it in a magazine like Muscle and Fitness or whatever, they're probably thinking, oh, the kettlebell swing and the Turkish get-up, or one of those two. And even though the kettlebell swing is a very fundamental kettlebell movement, what I always say is it is by no means a beginner movement. Like, the kettlebell swing is a ballistic movement. It's a repetitive power generating movement. And the ability to not only decelerate the load safely and effectively, but also you learn this dance between having to be very explosive and engaged and activated. And then you also learn in the same light how to turn off and be very relaxed as well. And so if you take sports, for example, like boxing, if someone were to throw a punch and stay engaged the whole time, that wouldn't really work. There's this snapping motion of going from tension and relaxation. And so a lot of times that coordination of that skill, that's a high level skill. And so what I tend to see is people will say like, oh, I want to do a workshop with you. I would love to learn, the kettlebell swing. And I'll say, okay, we'll get to that for sure. But there's a few steps before that. And oftentimes what I tend to see is most people, what they're coming in with is way lower than what's needed to safely and effectively do that. So to your point, if someone just grabs a kettlebell and wants to do a kettlebell snatch or 100 reps or whatever, man, there's a lot of steps before that. And even like with the kettlebell swing, like there's people who tout, and people even I respect in many regards for what they've done in the industry, but 10,000 swings or like 500 swings a day, and when they're doing that, they're not warming up, they're just grabbing it and going. And I'm just like, oh my God, shaking my head like, dude, there's just some sensible, like it's not even crazy, like some sensible rationality that somehow oftentimes when people do kettlebells, it just goes out the door and the window. But the kettlebell swing, there is some key steps before that. And what I find is that when you focus on that, it makes the whole journey so much easier. So even though in the beginning of your kettlebell journey, if you focus on posture awareness, core control, just some of the mechanics of a deadlift, learning how to hinge, all of those things, if you focus the majority of your time there, the learning curve goes like your progress is exponential. It's not like a linear line. It's I don't even know if the word is a bell curve. It's like maybe slow, and then boom.
Thanks for watching the Radical Health Rebel YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to share with your friends and family, or share via your social media. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to receive notifications of new video clips from the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode, completely ad-free, plus premium content, and join the Radical Health Rebel Patreon community, head on over to the Radical Health Rebel Patreon channel at www.patreon.com /Radical Health Rebel. Thanks again for watching.